The table was set for 10. The Ashford estate dining room had been arranged, as it always was for these Sunday dinners, with the kind of deliberate formality that announces itself before anyone sits down. The folded napkins in their silver rings, the tapered candles already lit at 7 in the evening, the particular floral arrangement Gloria Ashford insisted on because she had read somewhere that white flowers communicated sophistication and had never stopped believing it. The room smelled of slow-roasted meat and garlic and the waxy warmth of the candles. A hired server moved along the walls with practiced invisibility. Outside, the autumn light was failing, and the manicured lawn of the Ashford property was going grey in the dusk. It looked expensive. It was designed to look expensive. That was, in the end, the Ashford family's primary architectural ambition. Marcus Hale, 37 years old, a man who described himself to strangers as a financial analyst, was seated at the far end of the table. He had worn a navy blazer and his father's cufflinks. Two plain silver ovals that caught the candlelight in quiet intervals and meant nothing to anyone else in the room. He had been married to Diana Hale for 3 years. He had loved her quietly, the way he did most things, without announcement and without the expectation that the absence of announcement would be held against him. He had come to this house many times. He had sat at this table many times. He had eaten meals prepared by this kitchen and answered questions posed by this family, and driven home afterward in a car that contained, on most of those drives, a silence he could not entirely account for. He had never been made to feel welcome in any room of this house. That evening was not going to be different. Diana Hale, 35 years old, sat 2 seats to his left. She was composed and beautiful and carrying something she had decided several weeks earlier not to carry any longer. Her hands were flat on the linen tablecloth. Her posture was controlled and deliberate in the way of someone who has prepared for a specific moment and intends to inhabit it correctly. She had rehearsed what she intended to say. She had rehearsed the exact position of her body when she said it. She had thought about where to set the envelope and had decided in the end that directly in front of Marcus was clearest. Gloria Ashford, 62 years old, was the woman at the head of the table, the one who had always without apology set its temperature. She was Victor Ashford's wife, Diana's mother, and a woman who had constructed an entire social identity on the premise that the Ashford name represented a standard most people would never reach, and that this was not a tragedy, but a simple fact that distinguished the people who understood it from the people who did not. She wore a cream blouse and a strand of pearls and spoke in a register that managed to be polite and dismissive at the same time, a register she had spent decades refining until she could make someone feel inadequate without using a single word that could be extracted from context and identified as unkind. She was very good at this. She considered it a form of social fluency. Victor Ashford, 65 years old, sat at the opposite head. He had founded Ashford Supply Group 4 decades ago, a distribution and light manufacturing company that had grown steadily through the Midwest and Southeast, accumulating warehouse space and client contracts and the particular institutional credibility that comes from showing up reliably in an unglamorous industry for long enough that people stop asking whether you will still be there next year. He was a man who spoke in facts and figures and who had always believed, without examining the belief too closely, that financial success conferred a kind of moral authority, that the discipline required to build something real translated naturally into a right to be listened to in rooms beyond the one where the money was made. He was proud of his daughter. He was quietly skeptical of her husband, in the way of a man who has never been offered a satisfying explanation for why another man is worth less attention than he appears to deserve. Elliot Crane, 41 years old, was also at the table. He was a corporate attorney, polished in the specific way that comes from years of billing at a premium rate and cultivating the presentation of a man whose time is always more valuable than the time of the person across the table. His suits were tailored, his opinions were offered with a confidence calibrated to suggest expertise, even on subjects where his expertise was limited. He had been retained by the Ashford family for several years as their primary legal advisor, and he had grown in that time into something that functioned like a family member without carrying any of a family member's actual obligations. He sat near Diana. He had a way of leaning slightly toward her when he spoke. of angling his body in her direction as though the rest of the room was a distraction from their mutual understanding, and Gloria had chosen to interpret this as collegial attentiveness, and Victor had chosen not to notice it at all, and Marcus had noticed it from the first evening he encountered it and had filed it without reaction. Daniel Merritt, 52 years old, was seated across from Elliot. He had been introduced to the family by Marcus as a colleague from the firm, a description so deliberately incomplete that it could not be called inaccurate. He had accepted a glass of water and had declined wine and had answered the questions directed at him during the aperitif portion of the evening with the mild, self-effacing affect of a man whose professional function requires him to be present without being memorable. He had dark eyes that moved methodically across the room. He had set his phone on the table beside his dinner plate, screen down, in the casual way of professionals who have learned that the device is more useful when its presence is not remarked upon. The salad course had just been cleared when Diana stood. She reached beneath the table where she had placed the envelope before sitting, and she produced it and set it in front of Marcus. The table went quiet with the particular quality of quiet that happens when something has been introduced that cannot be taken back. The server near the wall stopped moving. Gloria's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes settled into satisfaction. The satisfaction of a woman watching an outcome she had helped engineer, who has waited long enough that the arrival of the moment feels like confirmation of a judgment she made years earlier and was too gracious to state aloud at the time. Diana said the marriage was not working. She said it clearly and without evident distress because she had processed the distress weeks earlier and was now operating from the side of the decision that felt like relief. She said she deserved a life that matched her ambitions. She said she had given the relationship the time and patience it required and that she was now choosing herself, a phrase that she had practiced and that sounded in the candlelit formality of that room both sincere and rehearsed. Gloria Ashford set down her wine-glass. She looked at her son-in-law and said, plainly and without particular effort at subtlety, that her daughter had always deserved a man whose reach extended beyond the salary of a junior analyst. She said that Diana had never been a woman designed for a life of modest ambitions. She said that she deserved someone who could actually afford her world, rather than a man who had spent 3 years borrowing space in it as though the invitation to stay would never be withdrawn. Marcus looked at the envelope. He did not open it. He placed both hands flat on the table on either side of it, and he looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who is solving an equation that has already resolved itself and is reviewing the answer. What none of the people at that table knew, except for Daniel Merritt, who had known it for years and considered it the most stable professional fact in his life, and Marcus, who had known it for his entire adult life and had never considered it a secret worth disclosing, was that Marcus Elliot Hale was the sole name beneficiary of the Edmund Hale Irrevocable Trust. The trust had been established by his late father, Edmund Hale, a man who had spent 4 decades assembling the kind of wealth that does not require a press release because it is organized well enough to speak for itself. The trust held 71% of a limited liability company called Hale Capital Partners LLC. 3 months before that dinner, Hale Capital Partners LLC had completed the acquisition of Ashford Supply Group for $47 million. The Ashford family home, the estate where this dinner was being served on white linen with silver napkin rings and white flowers to communicate sophistication, had been pledged as collateral against the acquisition loan. Victor Ashford had signed the pledging documents himself. He had shaken hands with the representatives of Hale Capital Partners at the closing and called it a good outcome for his legacy. He had never been told who the trust's beneficiary was. The acquisition documents identified the beneficial interest holder as the Edmund Hale Irrevocable Trust and listed the trustee as a Delaware trust company. Victor had not investigated further. His counsel, which was Elliott Crane's firm, had reviewed the documents. Neither had raised a question about the individual behind the trust. Diana had not been involved in the acquisition process. She had not been told who the acquirer's ultimate beneficial owner was. She had known that Ashford Supply Group had been sold, and that her father had called it a significant moment for the family's financial future. And she had accepted that, without pressing for details, because the details of her father's business had never been something she was invited to examine. Marcus owned more of the house they were sitting in than Victor did. He had owned it in the sense that matters legally and permanently for 3 months. He had sat at this table 3 times in those 3 months. He had eaten the food and answered Gloria's diminishing questions, and watched Elliot lean toward his wife and driven home in silence, and had not said a word. 49 days later, the lawyers would ask that dinner table to produce its documents. Some men do not lose their empire. They simply allow you to believe it was never there. Stay until the end, because you are going to watch a man lose a wife and recover a company, a legacy, and the silence he was wise enough to keep for longer than anyone at that table deserved. And if you believe that a quiet man's patience should never be mistaken for the absence of power, subscribe right now and leave the word deed in the comments, because the papers are about to speak. The morning Nora Vance called, Marcus was already at his desk. It was 6:14 a.m. on a Wednesday in early October, 3 weeks before the Sunday dinner. The offices of Hale Capital Partners occupied 3 floors of a building chosen for the same reason Edmund Hale had chosen most of his assets: correct for its function, priced appropriately, and designed to attract no attention from people who measured worth by appearance. Nothing announced itself as luxury. Everything functioned at a high level. That was the philosophy. Marcus had been in the office since 5:40. He had a habit of arriving before the building's ambient sound changed from the overnight mechanical hum of ventilation and servers to the occupied noise of people beginning work. He liked that hour between those 2 sounds. He used it for reading, for reviewing reports that required sustained attention, and for thinking through problems that the presence of other people would have interrupted. He had been reviewing the Ashford Supply Group transition files when his phone displayed Nora's number. Nora Vance, 45 years old, was his chief operating officer. She had worked with Marcus for 11 years, first at the predecessor entity to Hale Capital Partners, and then through the formalization of the trust's investment vehicle. She understood the structure of the trust with the granular clarity of someone who had spent years operationalizing it, which entities held which interests, which governance clauses had been negotiated into which agreements, and which of those clauses had been insisted upon by Marcus specifically and why. She understood that when Marcus went quiet on a call, he was not disconnecting, he was processing. She had learned not to fill the quiet. She told him about the request from the Ashford Supply Group operations side. Victor Ashford had submitted, through his retained post-acquisition consulting agreement, a formal recommendation to Hale Capital Partners that they authorize a reduction in force of 40 employees across the supply group's 2 primary distribution facilities before the end of the 3rd quarter. The stated rationale, as it appeared in Victor's written submission, was operational efficiency, elimination of redundant roles, and alignment of staffing with post-acquisition volume projections. The actual mechanism was a bonus clause buried 4 pages into the Transition Services Agreement, a clause that would release a one-time deferred payment to Victor contingent on the company meeting a specific cost reduction threshold within the first 12 months of the acquisition closing. 40 people losing their jobs would have triggered that payment. Victor had known this when he wrote the clause. His counsel had reviewed it. Elliot Crane had reviewed it. Marcus listened without interrupting. When Nora finished, he asked how many of those 40 positions were genuinely redundant and how long it would take to model an alternative that preserved the workforce. She said 2 to 3 days. He told her to take 3 and get it right. He said he did not want a plan designed to look good. He wanted a plan that was good. The workforce stabilization plan that Nora delivered 3 days later was thorough and operational. It identified 6 administrative positions now duplicative of functions performed by the Hale Capital back office team, positions that could be eliminated through attrition and voluntary reassignment without a single involuntary separation. It proposed a shared services arrangement between the 2 distribution facilities for procurement, logistics coordination, and HR administration, reducing overhead without touching floor-level staff. The 30-month projection showed the savings would exceed what the layoffs would have generated and would do so without productivity disruption, without unemployment insurance exposure, and without damaging the company's relationship with the labor pool in the communities it depended on. Marcus approved it the morning she delivered it. He composed one email to the Ashford Supply Group operations team, routed through the post-acquisition governance channels that the transition agreement had established, informing them that the reduction in force request had been reviewed and declined by the controlling interest. He attached the stabilization plan in full. He wrote at the bottom of the email that he expected a status update in 60 days. He did not tell Diana. She was not part of Hale Capital's operations and had never expressed an interest in becoming part of them. She had never asked him, in 3 years of marriage, the specific questions whose honest answers would have required him to explain who he was. At the facilities themselves, the employees who worked under the Ashford Supply Group roof knew the company had been acquired. They knew it the way workers always know these things, from the press release that HR had forwarded, from the logo that had been updated on the invoicing software, from the 2 men in suits who had toured the floor the week after closing and had shaken hands with people and said things like excellent operation and strong team before disappearing back into the elevator. The acquisition had been announced as a continuation of existing operations under new institutional ownership. Hale Capital Partners had been described only as a private equity vehicle. The identity of its beneficiary had not been mentioned. Most of the floor staff had read the press release once and returned to their work. Jamie Reyes, 28 years old, was the operations manager at the larger of the 2 distribution facilities, a converted industrial building in a regional city that had grown into a hub for the Supply Group's Midwest volume. He had been with Ashford Supply Group for 4 years and had been promoted twice, both times on the basis of results rather than tenure, which was the kind of thing that mattered to him. He was methodical and specific and had a way of identifying operational problems before they became operational failures that his team had come to rely on without quite being able to articulate. When the internal memo arrived informing the facility that the proposed layoff plan had been declined and that a new stabilization framework was being implemented, he read it 3 times at his desk. Then he printed it and walked to the corkboard outside his office and taped it in the center, above the shift schedules and the safety compliance reminders. He did not know the name Marcus Hale. He would learn it and he would remember it. Ruth Callahan, 56 years old, had been a floor supervisor at Ashford Supply Group for 19 years. She had seen 3 previous ownership transitions, 2 restructuring rounds, and the slow replacement of 2 CEOs. She had developed a fluency in institutional communication that most people who have only worked one job never acquire. She could read a memo and identify, with reasonable accuracy, whether it had been written by someone who understood the floor or someone who was managing optics. When the stabilization plan arrived, she read it carefully and told her team that someone up the chain had made a specific decision in their favor. She said she did not know who or why, but that the decision was correct, and that the work they had done for 19 years had been worth doing. She said that was sometimes what accountability looked like from a distance. Not a speech, not a gesture, just a plan that chose the right thing when the wrong thing would have been easier. Marcus had never met either of them. He had looked at their names in the staffing reports Nora had prepared and had decided on the basis of their tenure and their documented performance histories that they and everyone like them were the reason the stabilization plan mattered more than the bonus clause. The cufflinks had been a gift. That was always the first thing Marcus remembered when he held them. Plain silver, oval, without engraving, without any marking at all. His father Edmund had pressed them into his palm on the morning the trust was formally established, when Marcus was 26 and Edmund was 61, and still well enough to be proud without being sentimental about it. Edmund had looked at his son across a desk in a Delaware attorney's office with the gravity of a man who understands he is handing off something his whole life built, and who will not be there to see it used the way he intends. He held the cufflinks out. He said, "These belonged to my father." He said, "They are ordinary." He said, "That is the point." And then he said the thing he would say only once more before he died. The thing that had functioned since that morning as both a philosophy and an instruction. "Let the papers speak, son. They always will." Marcus had worn those cufflinks to his wedding. He had worn them to the closing dinner for the Ashford Supply Group acquisition, seated across from the transaction attorneys and the investment bankers who had structured the deal, none of whom had known who he was in relation to the family they had just sold to him. He had worn them to the Ashford estate on the evening Diana handed him an envelope, and he had been wearing them when Gloria Ashford looked across the table and told her daughter that she deserved better than the borrowed space a finance analyst could offer. In her world, he had not corrected her. He had looked at Diana instead. Diana had looked at the table. The first time Marcus Hale met Diana Ashford was at a charity auction in the atrium of a downtown hotel, a fundraiser for an arts endowment the trust supported. He had been introduced by the event coordinator only as affiliated with a private investment firm, a description accurate in every word and communicating almost nothing. He wore a dark suit and the silver cufflinks. He was outbid, definitively, on a small Calder mobile he had planned to put in the Hale Capital Common area because his father had believed interesting objects made people think more carefully. He accepted the outcome and moved toward the edge of the room, and Diana appeared beside him and said, without preamble, that she thought he had excellent taste. He said he agreed, and that he had just established conclusively that he did not have excellent timing. She laughed genuinely, which surprised him, because genuine laughter was not common at these events. They spent 40 minutes in conversation that had none of the social calculation of the room around them. By the end of the evening, he asked for her number, and she gave it to him without strategy. The Ashford family's disapproval had been immediate and structural. Victor had asked Marcus, early in the courtship, what firm he worked for and received a technically accurate but professionally incomplete answer. A private investment vehicle focused on acquisition and asset management, family-founded. Victor had nodded in the way of a man filing information he considers insufficient. Gloria had begun referring to Marcus in subsequent months as Diana's finance friend, in the particular tone that signals the speaker considers the relationship provisional. She asked Diana whether she was certain this was the direction she wanted her life to go, framing it as a question about ambitions while meaning it as a question about income. Diana told her mother she was certain and told Marcus about it in a way that communicated frustration with Gloria while leaving room for a form of agreement she did not name. Elliot Crane had said at a summer gathering in Marcus's first year with Diana that he admired people who were comfortable living simply, content without the pressure of building something larger than themselves. He said this directly to Marcus while filling his plate, smiling in a way that extended only as far as the muscles required. Marcus said thank you, ate his food, and drove home afterward, without mentioning it to anyone. The problem, as the marriage lengthened, was not that Marcus had a secret. The problem was that Diana had stopped being curious. She had spent the first year telling herself that she had chosen authenticity over status, that she had made a decision that reflected her own values rather than her family's, and that this was a form of courage. By the second year, she had stopped telling herself that story with the same conviction. By the third year, she had begun repeating her mother's language without seeming to notice, referring to Marcus's restraint as limitation, his quietness as passivity, his lack of performative ambition as evidence that he had settled rather than chosen. She spent more time with Elliot at business functions. She came home with less interest in the ordinary details of Marcus's days. She stopped asking about the trust office. She began to describe their life together in conversations with her mother, using a vocabulary of insufficient and deserving more that could have come from any of Gloria's sentences. Marcus had understood what was happening. He had understood it before she articulated it, and he had sat with the understanding in the quiet hours of the mornings before she woke, and he had not found a way to address it that did not require him to reveal things he had decided long before meeting her not to reveal to people who had not yet demonstrated they could receive them correctly. He had loved her, and the love had been real, and it had not required documentation. And in the end, it had not been enough for the version of herself she had decided to become. The invoice was for $340,000. The vendor did not exist. Nora Vance found it on the 14th day of the post-acquisition forensic audit, a Tuesday afternoon, in a row of a spreadsheet imported from Ashford Supply Group's accounts payable system. She had been looking for something slightly different when she found it, which is often how significant discoveries in financial forensics occur, not at the end of a targeted search, but sideways in the peripheral vision of a broader examination. She sent Marcus a message that said, "We have something." He replied, "When?" She replied, "Now." The audit had been written into the acquisition agreement as a standard post-close review of all acquired entities within 6 months of closing. Victor had signed that clause. Elliott Crane's firm had reviewed it and raised no objection, which, in light of what the audit would eventually find, was either a miscalculation or a confidence that the evidence was too well hidden to surface. The audit committee was independent, staffed by a forensic accounting firm, Hale Capital Partners, retained specifically for post-acquisition reviews, with authority to compel document production from all Ashford Supply Group personnel and affiliated parties. The invoice Nora found first was one of 23. The 23 invoices spanned a period of 19 months, beginning approximately 10 months before the acquisition process formally began and ending 2 months before the closing date. Each invoice was addressed to Ashford Supply Group from a consulting entity, a limited liability company registered in a state with minimal public disclosure requirements that listed no physical address, no employees, no public-facing website, no documented service agreements, and no work product of any kind in the company's own internal files. The invoices described services in language that was deliberately generic: strategic advisory, process consultation, distribution optimization review, operational transition facilitation. The amounts varied between $80,000 and $340,000. In total, the 23 invoices represented $2,100,000 drawn from Ashford Supply Group's operating accounts over 19 months and sent to an entity that existed on paper for the sole purpose of receiving the funds. Nora's team traced the consulting entity's ownership structure over 11 days. The connection to Elliott Crane's law firm was not direct. It had been designed not to be direct, organized through 2 intermediate holding layers in jurisdictions that offered limited public registry information. But the paper trail existed because paper trails always exist when money moves, and Nora's team was thorough and patient and did not stop when the first layer resolved to a generic entity name. When they reached the connection it held at every point of the chain, they documented each step. They did not speculate. They recorded what they found in the order they found it. The mechanism was straightforward once visible. The 23 invoices had been categorized as ordinary external consulting costs on Ashford Supply Group's books. They appeared in the operating expense line of the financial statements Hale Capital Partners had reviewed during diligence. They inflated the company's cost base and enterprise value calculation. The result, Hale Capital Partners had paid $47 million for a company whose clean books would have supported a materially lower price. The security footage was retrieved and catalogued by the Independent Audit Committee on the 19th day of the review. The system at Ashford Supply Group headquarters had been a standard commercial security installation, motion-triggered cameras covering all executive suite common areas, including the corridor to the administrative authorization terminal, stored on a local server that the audit committee subpoenaed under the governance clause before Victor or Diana or anyone in the Ashford family had understood the specific purpose of the document hold. The footage was intact. The server had not been modified. On 3 separate dates across the 14-month period before the acquisition closing, Diana Hale had been recorded on the security camera in the corridor leading to the administrative authorization terminal in the Ashford Supply Group Executive Suite. The physical authorization forms corresponding to those 3 dates were retrieved from the company's archival document files by the accounts team, which was cooperating with the audit committee. Diana's signature appeared on line 7 of each form, the line designated for executive approval of external consulting expenditures above $50,000. The dates, the camera footage, and the signed forms were consistent across all 3 instances. Hotel receipts from 2 separate cities, produced through a separate evidentiary process that Daniel Merritt coordinated through a civil litigation discovery mechanism available under the governance clause, placed Elliott Crane and Diana in proximity across 2 of the 3 signature dates. The records were documentary and specific. Daniel assembled the full evidence chain over 22 days. He worked with the Independent Audit Committee and the forensic accounting firm without drama and without announcing his conclusions before the documentation was complete. He produced a binder, 214 pages indexed by date and document type. He annotated every exhibit. He did not editorialize. The binder presented the facts in the sequence they had occurred and left the conclusions to form themselves. She had rehearsed the line. Anyone who watched Diana Hale stand at that dinner table could see it in the precision of her posture, in the distance behind her eyes. That was the specific distance of a person who has already processed the emotion of a moment and is now executing the logistical portion of it. She had made a decision weeks earlier in a conversation with Gloria that had lasted 2 hours and that had ended with Gloria squeezing her daughter's hand and saying that she had always known Diana would find her way to the right choice and that what came next would feel difficult for a short time and then feel like relief. The full context of that Sunday dinner was this. It had been Gloria's suggestion. Not the divorce, the occasion. Gloria had proposed a family dinner as the setting for Marcus to be informed of Diana's decision. The logic, as Gloria framed it, was that a family setting provided clarity and social weight, that it communicated to Marcus that this was a settled decision supported by people who loved Diana and knew her worth, and that it removed any ambiguity about whether negotiation was possible. The implication, left unstated because Gloria preferred implications to statements on the most important matters, was that the presence of the family would serve as a form of social confirmation that Diana was right, that Marcus was on the wrong side of a table that had never genuinely belonged to him, and that this moment was not a loss for Diana but a correction. Gloria had spent the dinner making that argument through every sentence she addressed to the room. She praised Elliot's acuity in navigating the post-acquisition transition. She referred to Victor's 4 decades of building something that mattered. She spoke about the importance of ambition in a partner, of choosing someone who could grow alongside you, rather than someone who required you to diminish your own sense of what was possible. She asked Marcus once, with a smile of professional warmth, how things were going at the firm. When Marcus answered briefly and accurately, describing the stabilization work in the most general terms available, she had nodded in the specific way of a person who has been confirmed in a prior assessment. Victor ate and drank and agreed when addressed, and watched Elliot with the expression of a man who had been given something to look at that he was not prepared to examine. Elliot was charming. He spoke about the operational improvements he had recommended for Ashford Supply Group post-acquisition, framing his continued involvement as an extension of his long-term advisory relationship with the family. He spoke with the fluency of a man who understands that the most effective form of confidence is the confidence that does not need to defend itself. He smiled at Diana at intervals that were precisely enough apart to avoid being read as significant. He looked at Marcus once, briefly, with the specific expression of a man who has already decided the outcome of the situation and is performing the courtesy of patience. Daniel Merritt had his phone on the table beside his plate. He ate slowly and watched everything with the unhurried attention of a professional who has learned that the most useful thing he can do in a room is observe it correctly. When Diana stood and placed the envelope in front of Marcus, Daniel lifted his phone from the table in the way of someone reaching for a glass of water and took a photograph. The image captured the signed papers, the wall clock behind Diana's shoulder displaying the time, and the faces of the people seated around the table. He would file the photograph with the evidence chain the following morning, along with the images he had taken of Victor's expression, Elliot's posture, and the envelope itself. Marcus opened the envelope. He read the first page. He read slowly, which was how he read everything. He folded the page and set it on the table beside his wine glass, which he had not touched since the salad course. He looked at Diana for a long moment, the particular look of a man reviewing a development he had already at some point in the previous months accepted as the most probable outcome and had allowed himself to grieve quietly in the hours before dawn. Then he reached toward his cuffs. He unfastened his father's cufflinks, the plain silver ovals, one and then the other. He set them on the table, side by side, beside the divorce papers. He looked at Diana for 5 seconds. He said nothing. Then he picked up the cufflinks, closed his fingers around them, placed them in his jacket pocket, and left the table. The server near the wall did not move. Gloria watched Marcus go and said to the room that sometimes the most dignified response to the inevitable was to let it pass without argument. She did not know, as she said it, what the word dignified was about to cost her. The litigation hold was filed at 9:02 the following morning. Warren Cole received it before he finished his coffee. Warren Cole, 48 years old, was the chief financial officer of Ashford Supply Group. He was a precise and methodical man who had spent 11 years in that role, processing information and making financial decisions with the kind of institutional consistency that organizations depend on and rarely acknowledge until the consistency becomes the problem. He had processed the 23 consulting invoices. He had not initiated them. He had not designed the vendor structure. He had been directed by Victor Ashford to approve the invoices as ordinary external consulting expenditures, and he had done so because the alternative at the time had felt like a personal risk he could not accurately calculate. He had known at the level of professional instinct that 11 years of accounting discipline produces that the invoices were irregular. The vendor name was unfamiliar. The service descriptions were generic. The amounts were significant. He had not investigated their destination. He had told himself in the way that people tell themselves things when the alternative is too uncomfortable to sustain, that irregular was not the same as fraudulent, and that his responsibility was to process what was approved above him, not to investigate the judgment of the man who owned the company. He had been wrong. He had lived with the wrongness at a low constant frequency for 19 months. When the litigation hold arrived in his email at 9:02 on a Monday morning, marked with the subject line and the law firm name, he recognized immediately and completely what it meant and what it meant for him personally, and he set his coffee mug down on his desk and sat very still for approximately 45 seconds. Marcus did not call Warren Cole. He did not orchestrate anything in relation to Warren Cole. He retained a separate law firm, separate from Daniel Merritt's firm, specifically for the civil litigation, and the two firms coordinated according to a documented protocol. Marcus's instructions to both teams were simple. They were to proceed correctly. Every document was to be preserved in its original form. Every deposition was to be taken in the appropriate sequence, following the established evidentiary chain. Every finding was to be reported through the proper legal channels without editorializing and without strategic amplification. The process was to be clean. There was to be no action that exceeded what the evidence and the applicable law specifically supported. Marcus said this to both teams in the same meeting, in the same words. He said it twice, not because he thought they might not have understood it the first time, but because he wanted the record of his instructions to be unambiguous. He said, "We do this correctly, every document, every deposition, every finding by the book." The independent audit committee had been Marcus's specific insistence during the deal negotiations. Victor's counsel, Elliott's firm, had proposed a lighter governance framework that would have given Hale Capital Partners quarterly reporting rights but limited its post-close investigative authority. Marcus had countered with a governance clause that included the independent audit committee, full document production authority, and a 6-month post-close review window. Elliott had pushed back. Marcus had held the position. The deal had closed with the clause intact. Marcus had insisted on it not because he had anticipated fraud. He had not been looking for fraud when he negotiated the clause. He had insisted on it because his father had taught him that governance structures were the difference between institutions that lasted and ones that did not, and that the correct time to establish authority over a process was before you needed to use it, not after. The morning after the dinner, while the litigation hold was being delivered and Warren Cole was sitting very still at his desk, Diana was in a real estate office in Midtown with her mother. They were reviewing listings for a 2-bedroom apartment in a building with a doorman and a gym and southern exposure, which Gloria had specified as essential. Diana was making notes on her phone. She was not afraid. She had made a decision and executed it, and the discomfort she had anticipated had not arrived with the force she had prepared for, and she had interpreted this as evidence that she had been correct. Gloria was asking about monthly maintenance fees. Diana was thinking about how a room looked in afternoon light. She was standing at the window of a unit on the 34th floor when her phone displayed a calendar notification. The notification came from the Ashford Supply Group corporate calendar, which she was still logged into through a shared family account that no one had thought to revoke. The notification informed her that an extraordinary general meeting of shareholders of Hale Capital Partners LLC had been scheduled for the following Thursday at the Ashford Supply Group headquarters boardroom. The notice identified the meeting as called by the controlling beneficiary of the Edmund Hale Irrevocable Trust. Diana looked at the notification for a moment. She returned to the window. She said to her mother that the maintenance fee sounded reasonable. Victor Ashford read the formal meeting notice 3 times. He had received it by courier and by email simultaneously on a Tuesday morning. He was at the kitchen island of the Ashford estate when the envelope arrived. The same kitchen island where he had stood months earlier in the excitement of the acquisition closing, when he had called the sale a moment of validation for everything he had spent 4 decades building. He read the notice quickly the first time and felt a coldness that was not quite alarm and was not quite nothing. He read it slowly the second time and felt the cold become specific. Extraordinary General Meeting, Controlling Beneficiary, the Edmund Hale Irrevocable Trust. He read it the third time, with the attention of a man who is searching for a different interpretation and not finding one, and then he called Elliot Crane. Elliot told him it was almost certainly procedural, a standard governance formality required by the acquisition agreement, nothing that warranted concern. He said this with the measured steadiness of a man who has learned that projecting confidence is a professional obligation even when the underlying analysis is uncertain. He said he would accompany the family to the meeting in his capacity as their retained counsel, and that his presence would ensure the family's interests were represented throughout. Victor had agreed. He had not slept well that week. The meeting was held in the Ashford Supply Group headquarters boardroom on Thursday morning. Victor arrived with Elliot, who had brought 2 associates from his firm. Diana came at Elliot's suggestion, on the stated basis that her recent separation from Marcus meant she had a potential interest in the proceedings that deserved representation. Warren Cole was already in his chair at the far end of the table when they arrived, positioned near the door in the way of someone who has chosen where to sit with some deliberateness. He did not meet Victor's eyes. The Independent Audit Committee convened the meeting with formal order. The forensic auditor, a woman in her mid-50s with an unhurried, precise manner and no apparent interest in the room's emotional temperature, presented the findings. She placed the 23 invoices on the projection screen, one group at a time. She described the consulting entity structure. She traced the holding layers to Elliot Crane's firm with documentary support for each step. She displayed the security footage deals on screen. 3 images, 3 dates, 1 signature each from a different angle of the same authorization terminal corridor. She displayed the hotel receipts. She presented the net effect on the acquisition valuation in precise dollar terms. She did not raise her voice. She did not repeat herself for rhetorical effect. She moved through the material in the order it had occurred and allowed the sequence itself to carry its weight. Then she paused. She advanced to a new slide. She said that pursuant to the governance clause and in the interest of complete disclosure for the record of the meeting, the beneficial ownership of Hale Capital Partners LLC was being formally identified. The slide showed the corporate structure of Hale Capital Partners. The auditor said that the controlling beneficial interest, representing 71%, was held by the Edmund Hale Irrevocable Trust. She advanced again. The next slide showed the trust document. It showed the establishment date. It showed the trustee, the Delaware Trust Company. It showed the beneficiary field. The sole name beneficiary of the Edmund Hale Irrevocable Trust was Marcus Elliot Hale. His full name was in standard legal type. His date of birth was beside it. The acquisition completion date appeared at the bottom of the page. Victor Ashford's expression moved through a sequence that required less than 5 seconds. First in comprehension, because the name was his daughter's husband's name, and that could not be correct because he had never been told and had never thought to ask who the trust beneficiary was. Then calculation, the rapid internal accounting of what the name meant in relation to the acquisition, the governance clause, the litigation hold, the documents on screen, then recognition, complete and irrevocable, and then something for which the English language does not have a single precise word. The specific vertigo of a man who has been standing on a surface he believed was solid ground and has just understood that the solidity was borrowed and the lender is in the room. Diana looked at the name on the screen. She looked at it for 3 seconds, then she looked at Marcus. Marcus was seated at the table to the side, not at the head, not at the foot. He had been in that chair since before Victor arrived. He was wearing his navy blazer and his father's silver cufflinks. He had a glass of water in front of him. He said nothing. He looked at no one specifically. He looked at the table with the expression of a man who is waiting for a process to complete because the process is correct and it requires his patience more than it requires his comment. The auditor finished her presentation. The room was quiet with a quality that was not silence but the absence of any response adequate to what had just been displayed. Elliot Crane had not moved from his chair in over a minute. Marcus picked up his water glass. He drank. He set it down. He did not speak. She caught him in the parking structure. Marcus had taken the elevator to the second level of the structure adjacent to the Ashford Supply Group building and was walking toward his car, a dark sedan of a model and age that were both unremarkable, when Diana's footsteps became audible behind him, sharp on the concrete, fast. The particular sound of someone who has been running and is now walking quickly because the running became conspicuous. He stopped and turned. She had come through the stairwell door. Her expression had the particular quality of someone who has discarded the prepared version of what she intended to say in favor of something less organized and more urgent. She said she had not known. She said her father had managed the finances of Ashford Supply Group and that she had not been involved in the accounts payable process. She said she had signed things when she was asked to sign them because she had trusted the people who asked her to. She said the invoices had been presented to her as ordinary expenditures and she had not had reason to question them. She said she was not the architect of any of it. Marcus listened. He waited for her to finish without giving any indication of what he intended to say. Then he said, "The security footage places you at the authorization terminal on 3 separate dates across 14 months. He said the signed forms bear your signature on the executive approval line. He said the dates are in the binder. He said nothing about intent. He stated the documentary facts in the order they had been established. She said he had no right to have allowed her to stand at a dinner table and deliver a speech without knowing who he was. She said that if she had known the truth, things would have been different between them. She said that his silence had been a form of deception." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He stood in the concrete and fluorescent light of the parking structure, and he was quiet in the way he was always quiet, without restlessness, without the visible signs of a man suppressing something he wants to say. Then he said that she had never once asked him. He said that she had been his wife for 3 years and had not asked him a single question about his professional life that she had been willing to receive a complete answer to. He said that he had never been deceptive. He said that she had been incurious and that those were different things and that the difference was not one he was responsible for. Diana had no reply that arrived in time. The words held their shape in the silence of the structure and did not collapse. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket. He produced the silver cufflinks. He held them in his open palm, extended slightly between them, not as an offering and not as a demonstration, simply as an object present in the space they shared. She looked at them. She had seen them on his cuffs at 100 dinners in 100 morning rooms, and she had never asked where they had come from or what they meant. He said his father used to say something. He said it quietly and without emphasis as a fact and not a conclusion. He said his father had said it to him on the morning a trust was established in his name, and had said it once more before he died. He said, "Let the papers speak. They always will." He closed his hand, placed the cufflinks back in his pocket, and walked to his car. He did not look back. Victor Ashford received the civil complaint at his home at 7:15 on a Friday morning. He was still in his robe. The process server had rung the doorbell of the Ashford estate, the house that was pledged as collateral, the house that Gloria had decorated and maintained for 31 years as the physical statement of what the Ashford name represented. And Victor had answered it in the robe he wore on mornings when he had not slept well and had not gotten up at his usual hour, and the envelope had been placed in his hands, and he had stood in the doorway of his own home reading the first page of a civil complaint that named him as a defendant in an action brought by Hale Capital Partners, LLC. He read it at the kitchen island. He read it slowly and completely, which was how he had always read legal documents, because he had spent 4 decades in business learning that the sentence that matters is usually not the first one. The complaint was thorough and specific. It described the 23 invoices, the vendor structure, the holding layers, the connection to Elliott Crane's firm, and the net financial harm to Hale Capital Partners as a result of an acquisition price that had been inflated by fraudulent operating expense reporting. It named Victor Ashford and Elliott Crane and the consulting entity. It named the holding companies. It sought $2,100,000 in direct damages plus consequential damages calculated on the basis of the differential between the price paid and the price that would have been supported by clean financials. Victor's post-acquisition consulting agreement with Ashford Supply Group was terminated by a separate notice delivered in the same envelope. Victor had earned under that agreement the equivalent of a modest annual salary for 3 months of work. He would not earn more. Elliott Crane received his notice from the state bar several days after the civil complaint was filed. The bar complaint had been prepared by the litigation team on the basis of the forensic findings, with Warren Cole's cooperative statement forming a significant part of the evidentiary record. The bar's disciplinary committee opened a formal investigation, and Elliott's license to practice was suspended pending its completion. His firm issued a statement acknowledging the matter and expressing full cooperation with the investigation. The statement did not mention Elliott by name after the first sentence. 2 of his firm's partners, who had not been aware of the specific structure of the consulting entity, retained separate counsel. Gloria Ashford learned the specific terms of the estate collateral on a Saturday afternoon from a letter that arrived by certified mail from the Delaware Trust Company, acting as trustee of the Edmund Hale Irrevocable Trust. The letter set out the terms of the acquisition loan covenant and the conditions under which the collateral pledge could be reached in the event of a civil judgment against Victor. Gloria read it once standing in the front hallway where she had opened the envelope. She read it again at the kitchen table. She called Victor into the room. She did not speak while he confirmed, in the specific vocabulary of a man who signed documents he did not always read completely, that the house had been pledged as collateral and that the pledge was enforceable against a judgment of the size described in the civil complaint. Gloria had stood in the Ashford estate for 31 years. She had chosen its rooms and its colors and its furniture and its flowers. She had built her understanding of herself in significant part on what the house communicated about the family that owned it. She had stood at its dinner table and told her son-in-law that her daughter deserved someone who could afford her world and not merely borrow space in it. The sentence had not aged well. Warren Cole had cooperated fully from the morning the litigation hold arrived. He retained his own counsel within 24 hours and produced a signed statement 48 hours after that. He documented the instructions he had received, the dates on which the invoices had been approved, the names involved at each stage of the direction chain, and his own understanding of the destination of the funds. His statement was detailed, chronologically organized, and corroborated at multiple points by the forensic audit's independent findings. His cooperation was early, specific, and material to the evidence chain. The civil settlement he reached with Hale Capital Partners reflected the degree to which his cooperation had reduced the cost and duration of the litigation. He was not made financially whole for what he had processed. He was also not ruined. He had understood from the morning the hold arrived that there was a difference between being a participant in a fraudulent scheme and being its designer, and that acknowledging the former honestly was the only available path to a future that was not defined entirely by the latter. Elliott Crane stopped returning Diana's calls the morning his bar complaint appeared in the disciplinary committee's public database. The complaint was published at 9 in the morning, consistent with the committee's standard processing schedule. Diana had placed her first call at 9:20. By 10:30, the second had gone to voicemail. By noon, the third had as well. She sat in the apartment she was renting month to month and held her phone and looked at the disciplinary committee's database on its screen and understood something that she had known at a level below articulation for quite some time. She had known it the way people know things they have organized their behavior around not knowing, which is to say, fully and deniably. Each outcome had arrived separately. Each had been documented, processed through the correct channel, and produced at the appropriate time in the sequence. There had been no manufactured drama, no orchestrated humiliation, no act that exceeded what the evidence and the process supported. There had been a governance clause and an audit committee and a binder of 214 pages, and a forensic auditor who presented findings in a boardroom without raising her voice. The papers had spoken, that was all. Marcus Hale stood at the front of the Ashford Supply Group warehouse floor on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the EGM. He was not comfortable with this part. He had spent his adult professional life in the architecture of financial structures, in the quiet rooms of trust administration and acquisition governance, and he had not built the skill set or the personal style of a man who addresses crowds. He knew this. He had said it to Nora. She had said that knowing it and declining to do it were different choices, and that in this particular case, the employees of Ashford Supply Group had earned the right to hear from the person at the top, directly in the building where they worked, not through a memo or a company email or a statement from a communications team. She had said that the moment required the person, not the institutional voice. Marcus had agreed. He was not the kind of man who disagreed with Nora when she was right. Ruth Callahan had arranged a small elevated platform near the center of the floor, a logistics item, solid wood, that brought the speaker to a height from which the room could be addressed without shouting. The warehouse was operational, pallets of inventory at the edges, the ambient sound of equipment at rest, the smell of cardboard and diesel, and the particular institutional cleanliness of a floor run by people who take their work seriously. 112 employees had assembled. They had come from both active shifts. Some were in safety vests, some had clipboards. They stood in the configuration of people who have been told to gather without being told exactly why, which is to say they were alert and slightly wary and prepared for something that might require adjusting to. Marcus stood on the platform. He had a single sheet of notes that he held at his side. He did not read from it. He said that nobody was losing their job that day. He said it plainly and without preparation. He said nobody. He let the word hold its own weight. Then he said it once more. He told them that a clause had existed in the transition agreement that would have made 40 positions contingent on a financial benchmark to be met before the end of the third quarter. He told them the clause had been voided. He told them the workforce stabilization plan would govern the company's labor strategy going forward, and that the plan had been designed not in an office somewhere with no view of the floor, but with detailed input from operations, and that it prioritized the institutional knowledge of the people who had been doing this work for years because that knowledge was, in actual operational terms, the most valuable thing Ashford Supply Group had. He introduced Jamie Reyes and told the room that Jamie would be taking an expanded operations role across both facilities. Jamie was in the front row and did not appear to have been told this would happen publicly, and his expression moved through surprise into something more settled and more serious. Marcus introduced Ruth Callahan and said that Ruth would be part of the operational advisory group that would help Hale Capital Partners understand the company from the inside, because the inside was where the company actually lived and worked. Ruth Callahan did not change her expression. She nodded once. Marcus told the room that anyone who wished to leave under the voluntary severance fund had until the end of the month to consider the option, that the terms were fair, and that neither choosing to leave nor choosing to stay would have any effect on how they were regarded by the company going forward. He said it was a genuine choice. He said he meant that. After he finished, no one responded for approximately 4 seconds, the kind of pause that happens in a room full of people who have learned through experience to be cautious about institutional promises. And then Ruth Callahan began to clap and the room followed her. Marcus stepped off the platform. He shook Jamie Reyes' hand and thanked him for what he had done with the facilities in the 4 years before the acquisition. He shook Ruth Callahan's hand and thanked her for staying when she could have left, and for reading the first memo correctly when she had every reason to read it with skepticism. In the car afterward, Nora sat in the passenger seat and was quiet for a while. The city moved past the windows in the grey light of a late autumn morning. Then she said that he had done the right thing, and that the room had known it. Marcus looked at the street ahead. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the silver cufflinks and turned them over in his palm. They were exactly what they had always been, plain, oval, unremarkable, the weight of a specific morning 22 years ago, pressed into a small and durable shape. He thought of Edmund Hale, who had built the trust not as a monument, but as a mechanism designed to function correctly and quietly, and for a long time. He thought of the morning in the Delaware attorney's office, the particular weight of his father's hand. He thought of the instruction, not offered as wisdom in the abstract, but as practical guidance from a man who had spent his life learning that legal structures and documented facts are the most reliable form of honesty available to people who live in a world that often prefers performance to substance. The papers had spoken. They had spoken for Marcus when the room at the Ashford estate had not left him space to speak for himself. They had spoken for the 112 employees who had not known until that morning that the decision about their jobs had been made months earlier by someone they had never met and made in their favor. They had spoken for the $47 million that should have been paid for an honest set of books. They had spoken for the collateral pledge and the consulting invoices and the authorization forms and the hotel receipts and the bar complaint. They had done what they were always going to do. A man who builds correctly does not need to explain what he has built. He needs only to allow it to function. The patience required for that, the willingness to hold the knowledge of what you own without the compulsion to display it, is not passivity. It is not indifference. It is the rarest form of confidence, the kind that does not require an audience. Edmund Hale had understood this. He had pressed it into 2 plain silver ovals and handed it to his son on a morning when the ink was barely dry on the documents that made it permanent. The papers had been written. The papers had spoken. They had done exactly what they were always going to do, in exactly the order they were always going to do it, without assistance, without hurry, and without a single word from the man who had simply been wise enough to let them.